Joe Manchin puts an end to the Build Back Better bill. Can the U.S. economy survive? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, we have to understand how dependent the U.S. economy is on asset prices. We'll start by going over a chart, 1950 all the way to today's date. This is market cap to GDP, or the Buffett indicator, as some people call it. On the left, we go from 0% up to 250%. And we start off in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. It's right around 50 to 100%. So the market cap of the entire stock market is about 50 to 100% of GDP. Then in 1980, it comes all the way down to 30, maybe 40%. And then from 1980, it gradually goes up and up and up till we get to a peak, or a temporary peak, the dot-com bust, where it was over 150% of GDP. Now that sounds like a lot until you look at where it is today. Over 210% of GDP, a staggering number. And what this shows us is how financialized the economy has become since the early 1980s. And I know a lot of you watching this video right now are saying, yeah, George, I get it. The economy's been financialized, but so what? Who cares? Why is that a bad thing? Why should I be concerned? Let's think this through. What it means is a larger percentage of your purchasing power in aggregate total in the United States is dependent on the value of people's stock portfolio. Let's look at it in terms that everyone can understand. We've got, in a healthy economy, we've got to produce in order to consume. You can think in a very simple economy with just 3 farmers, one grows cows, one grows cotton, the other grows wheat. If they just sit on their couch and do nothing, they cannot consume. They need to consume and then produce more than they consume. That's how they get wealthy. And even in a modern economy like we have today, the principles are still the same. This is what happens in a healthy economy. You produce to consume. And to get wealthy, you have to produce more than you consume. But this is not what happens when we financialize the economy. And I'll give you a specific example. Let's say we've got a teacher in California. This teacher is making $50,000, $75,000 a year. And in 2012, they come in and pay $250,000 for a house. Or maybe it's in the late 90s, something like that. Now this house is worth $2.5 million. Now, yes, we have had inflation, but not that much inflation since 2012. So she or he has increased their purchasing power tremendously. They're a millionaire, for heaven's sakes. They can cash out of that house and live the rest of their life without having to work. But did they produce more than they consume? Absolutely not. They didn't produce one extra widget, one extra service. They might not have even worked an extra hour at their teaching job in order to get this, call it $2 million plus in purchasing power. This may be great for the individual teacher, but if we do this as a society, it is completely unsustainable. And at some point in time, the house of cards has to come crashing down. But the story doesn't end there. We've got to think through the knock-on effects. If this teacher has an extra $2 million of purchasing power, this creates excess artificial demand. So that artificial demand goes into more businesses. To a certain extent, one man's spending is another's income. So all these businesses are created as a result of this artificial demand from the financialization of the economy. This creates malinvestment, a misallocation of resources. So when the stock market collapses and goes down to a more healthy level, let's call it its historic trend line, right around 50% of GDP, all of these businesses that were built on this artificial demand collapse as well. That's what the Austrians talk about when they say malinvestment and a misallocation of resources. A good example would be a concrete company that was set up by some aspiring entrepreneur that maybe saved up $100,000 back in 2006. He saw demand for concrete going through the roof. Why? Because there was artificial demand that was created by asset prices being in a bubble. This was the housing market bubble I'm referring to specifically. So he goes out, he doesn't understand Austrian economics. He takes his $100,000 of savings and he buys equipment to start his concrete business. Well, then what happens is the bubble implodes. He loses everything, including his life savings. This is the type of devastation that occurs when you build an entire economy around asset bubbles. But let's not just focus on the stock market. Let's also look at the housing market. This is a chart going all the way back to 1950, but the trend line would be consistent going all the way back to 1890, just FYI. Goes to today's date, and these are real home prices. So home prices adjusted for inflation. Going back to 1950, we're pretty consistent here. It goes up a little bit in the 1970s. Then in the 1980s goes up, it comes back down to its historic trend line in the late 90s. And then, you guys know the story well. From here, we go straight up. It goes parabolic till it peaks out in 2006. And then it comes crashing down very close to its historic trend line, notice. And then it goes straight up. And then we go parabolic as of 2020 to an all-time high. The housing market, even adjusted for inflation, is higher today than it was in 2006. But let's think about this in more detail. We've got the economy being more financialized. In other words, the economy is more dependent upon asset prices. So we can imagine when the stock market is going straight up, what is that doing to artificial purchasing power? It's increasing. But then the dot-com bust comes crashing down, and what do we have to do? We have to inflate a housing bubble to make up for the artificial demand that is being lost. But what happens when the housing bubble crashes and the stock market crashes along with it? All of the artificial demand, poof, it's gone. But then the central planners come in and they have to do something. So instead of letting all of the malinvestment and misallocation of resources flush out of the system and start from a strong base and then grow into the future in a way that's far more sustainable, they choose to just, we'll call it print money, to use that term very loosely. In this case, quantitative easing. This drives asset prices even higher than they were before. But what's interesting is although our economy becomes more and more and more dependent on those asset bubbles, the standard of living doesn't really improve. As an example, let's use the 1980s. I think most of you watching this video were alive way back in the good old days of the 1980s. Let's look at this chart. What was housing? Was it in a massive bubble? Not really. Well, look at the stock market. It was extremely low. So we didn't have a lot of artificial purchasing power, therefore a lot of artificial demand circulating in the economy, chasing goods and services, creating additional nominal GDP, if you want to look at it in those terms. But today, the housing market's at an all-time high. The stock market's at an all-time high. But I would ask you, is our standard of living that much better today than it was back in the 1980s? I don't think so. We've got a lot of things like the internet today and Uber that make things easier, but it's not dramatically different. But our purchasing power should have increased exponentially because of the value of the stock market today and the value of most people's home equity. So you see what's happened is our artificial purchasing power has gone straight up, but our real purchasing power as a result of producing to consume has actually gone down. So when that artificial bubble deflates, will have to depend, as far as our level of consumption, will depend on how much we produce, but our level of production or productivity has gone down dramatically. We've just papered over that with asset bubbles. And if you don't believe me, let's go through another quick thought experiment. We'll go all the way back to the 1970s. The stock market in 72 to 74 went down by 50% in nominal terms. The exact same number that we had during the GFC. Now, for those of you that were alive in the early 1970s and can remember this, did we have a GFC back then? Was that catastrophic to the global economy and the United States economy like the GFC was? And then you say, George, well, the GFC wasn't that bad because asset prices recovered. Yeah, that's because of quantitative easing. Again, artificial demand, an artificial stimulant to the economy that's unsustainable, that actually makes things worse. So let's look at the GFC through the lens of actual free market capitalism, where they would not have come in and saved the banks. There would have been no bailouts. There would have been no artificial, quote unquote, money printing. You guys that remember the GFC, like I do, I lived through it. I was an adult. I remember it like it was yesterday. What do you think would have happened if the Fed would not have stepped in and done quantitative easing? If the government would not have stepped in with their deficit spending? It would have looked a lot like Japan, where the stock market today is still lower than it was in 1990. And in a lot of the real estate markets there, housing prices are also lower today than they were in 1990. Again, just think about what would happen to the US economy if stocks went down by 50%, the housing market went down by 50%, and never, ever recovered. You know as well as I do, the standard of living would have plummeted. We would have gone into a depression that most likely would have been far worse than the 1930s. But unfortunately, because we tried to paper over the problem, the depression we get in the future will make the depression we would have got during the GFC look like a kid's birthday party. Now keep in mind, it could be an inflationary depression just as easily as a deflationary depression. But the key takeaway for step number one is to go through these thought experiments so you realize how dependent the US economy is on these asset bubbles and how that is completely unsustainable. And the longer we kick the can down the road, the more financialization of the economy is required, which really distorts the underlying fundamentals to a greater degree. So when the point comes when we do have to pay the fiddler, it makes things much, much worse. Step number two, the connection between government deficit spending and asset prices. In step number one, we talked about how the US economy is dependent on asset prices. But now let's talk about how asset prices are dependent on government deficit spending. And what is the Build Back Better bill or act? It's government deficit spending. So this is going to be very simple. We just have a chart of the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation going back to 2000 all the way to today's date, 2021. On the left, we go from 1,000 up to 4,500. At the start of 2000, the S&P right around 2,500. Then we had the dot-com crash, dropped all the way down to about 1,000 and gradually worked its way back up, not to a high water mark, more on that in a moment, but it worked its way back up to call it 2,000. Then it crashed again down to 1,000 and it works its way all the way back up. Now we're in this massive bubble prior to the cerveza sickness. And then we have a huge crash again, but then we skyrocket straight up to all-time highs, like we discussed in step number one, where the market cap to GDP is over 200%. And now I have a question for all of you watching this video right now. When I was going through this chart, did you notice something? Kind of like a timeline here? What I did is I measured the years approximately that it took the stock market to get to its prior high water market before the crash. So the dot-com bust, it took 14 years to get back to that high water mark. The GFC, it took 4 years to get back to the high water mark that preceded the crash. For the cerveza sickness, it took 4 months. Now, why is this important? Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of government deficit spending during these times. You can see that during the dot-com bust, there was literally zero government deficit spending. In fact, we ran a surplus. It was the opposite of deficit spending. So let's think this through. We had zero deficit spending on a GDP, nominal GDP back then, about 10 trillion. But fast forward to the GFC, and you can see by this chart that when you combine the 2 years there, the shaded area with the recession, it gives us about 2.5 trillion in government deficit spending. So you see, we spent more money and it shortened the time that it took the market to get back to its prior high water mark. But then let's move on to the cerveza sickness. We didn't spend 2.5 trillion. We spent about 6 trillion. And I would argue we spent a lot more than that. But let's just use this chart as a specific proxy. So $6 trillion of deficit spending. And yes, it is true, this reduced the time that it took to get to its prior high water mark once again. So we go from zero deficit spending, it takes 14 years. 2.5 trillion, it takes 4 years. 6 trillion, it takes 4 months. And I'm sure right about now your friend and family member Fred is saying, okay, George, I don't get it. What's the problem? So it's great. The government should deficit spend even more. And then we'd all get rich because asset prices would go through the roof. But what your friend and family member Fred isn't realizing is every single time the government's deficit spends even more, it increases the percentage of government spending that's responsible for nominal GDP. Let me say that another way to make it very clear. As the government deficit spending goes up, the percentage of overall economic output that's a result of government spending increases. What happens if we get to 100% of the economy as a result of government spending? Now we have pure central planning and communism. And to illustrate this, you'll notice I put nominal GDP to the right. So during the dot-com bust, the amount of government spending as a percentage of GDP stayed the same. GFC, it increased dramatically. And during the cerveza sickness, look at this. Over 25% of overall GDP is a result of government deficit spending. So just think how much more power your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam has over the economy today than he had just back in 2019. Step number 3, we now know the economy equals asset prices, and asset prices equal government spending and central planning. We've got to throw the Fed and quantitative easing in there as well. So to answer the question, if we see less BBB, in other words, less government deficit spending in the future, can the economy survive? The answer is definitively no, it can't. But the pushback I'm going to get there from your friend and family member Fred is he's going to say, George, this whole thought experiment is completely pointless because yes, the economy might be dependent on government spending, but if we see another crash in the stock market or the housing market, the government's going to come in and just spend another 10 trillion, 20 trillion, 30 trillion, whatever they need to spend to make sure that asset prices go back up. They've done it in the past. They'll do it indefinitely into the future. But your friend and family member Fred hasn't thought this through thoroughly. Here's my point. Let's look at this line right here. Very important. So important, I've written the word key, exclamation point. So what is going on with this line? This is a chart of core CPI, where they get rid of food and energy in the calculation. It's a little bit smoother here. But I want to point this out. This is extremely important that you get your mind around this. There's a chart going back to 1980 all the way to 2021. And this is during this time frame, which we discussed earlier, where we had this financialization in the US economy. And I've actually written it right here so you can get a visual, perfect visual, in fact, that back, let's say in 1980, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam was that much of the US economy. But in 2000, he grew to about that much. Today, he's that much of the US economy. And it's not just your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam that's done all the financializing. It's also the seasoned pro, the hedge fund managers, the banksters out there with their fleece jackets. And of course, the Fed with their quantitative easing, Operation Twist, special purpose vehicles, buying corporate debt, you name it, all of their shenanigans, which has created this powder keg of financialization. But let's get back to the main point, and that's focusing on the fact that we have seen core CPI skyrocket in 2020 and 2021. Why is this significant? Because it's gone down in pretty much a straight line during this period of government spending, Fed intervention, and central planning, i.e. money printing, using that term loosely. This is the first time that they have been money printing during this entire time frame when we've actually seen core CPI going parabolic. So here's the main point. We have to understand that politicians in general are sociopaths. And I'm not saying that as a joke. They care about one thing and one thing only. That is power, control, and being reelected. That is their number one priority. And I would challenge all of you watching this video right now, just ask yourself the question, with any of these politicians you see on TV daily, if given the choice, do you think they would gladly crush the US economy just to get reelected? I think 99% of you are not just going to say yes, but you're going to say, hell yes. That's a no-brainer. And what's the fastest thing they can do to not be reelected? It's to create consumer price inflation. Because the average Joe and Jane might not watch my videos. They might not be a rebel capitalist. They might not care about macroeconomics. But one thing they do care about is their grocery bill going up, the price they pay at the gas pump going up, and their rent payments going up. They get that, and they understand it, and they see it on a daily basis. So the next question becomes, what is causing this consumer price inflation? Or what is the main contributing factors? It's quantitative easing, followed by deficit spending, and in general, just doing what they need to do to prop up asset prices and prop up the economy. Said another way, if the politicians continue to prop up asset prices and the economy through their deficit spending into the future, it almost guarantees they will not be reelected. So they're going to be left with a choice. Either they can continue to blow air into these asset bubbles and not get reelected, or they can allow the Fed to raise interest rates, maybe force them, coerce them to raise interest rates, to crush asset prices, crush the economy, and therefore have a glimmer, a ray of hope of actually getting elected again in the future. So we started off the video by asking the question, can the US economy survive less or no deficit spending from the US government? But I think a better question would be to ask, can the US economy survive politicians? And the answer there is unequivocally no. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.